I'm Naomi Firestone, and I'd like to welcome you here tonight on behalf of the Jewish Book Council. Women of the Book is the second program in Jewish Book Council's new literary series, Unpacking the Book, Jewish Writers in Conversation, hosted in this wonderful venue, the Jewish Museum. Jewish Book Council is a not-for-profit dedicated to promoting the reading, writing, and publishing of books of Jewish interest. Find out more at jewishbookcouncil.org or pick up a rack card on your way out for a full list of JBC programs, awards, and publications. Before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to first ask that you silence or shut down your cell phones. And most importantly, I'd like to give a special thanks to all of our sponsors for their support. The David Berg Foundation, the Jewish Museum, specifically Colin, Samuel, Ronya, and Will, the National Book Foundation, Jewish Women's Archive, and Tablet Magazine, an online publication committed to Jewish writing. And thank you to JBC staff, Carolyn Hessel, Nat Bernstein, Carol Kaufman, Mimi Frank, and Emma Morgenstern for all their hard work to help make tonight's evening possible. Following this evening's program, we welcome you to join us for a book sale, author signing, and reception. During the reception, we encourage you to visit the Jewish Museum exhibits Repetition and Difference and Laurie Simmons' How We See. And we hope that you'll join in for a guided tour of the exhibit Repetition and Difference at 8 p.m. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our series moderator. Bari Weiss is the Associate Book Review Editor at the Wall Street Journal. Before joining the book review, she worked as an op-ed editor at the Journal and continues to write regular profiles and op-eds for the page. For 2 years, Bari was a senior editor at Tablet Magazine, where she edited the site's political and news coverage. She's also written for Haaretz, The Forward, and the New York Sun. Be sure to look for Bari on New York One, where she talks about new books she likes on a segment called The Book Reader. I'd like to extend my personal thanks to Bari for all of her help putting this program together. She's an incredible moderator and host for the series, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to welcome her here tonight. Thank you so much, and enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Naomi. Can you guys hear me? Thank you, Naomi, and thank you all so much for coming. Before we get to the good stuff, the people to my left, a quick logistical note. After about 45 minutes, we're gonna open this up for Q&A, but a twist, we're not going to give you the microphone, we're gonna take the note cards that you're either sitting on or have in your hands. If you don't have one for some reason, you can raise your hand now and one of the Jewish Book Council staffers will come around and give it to you. And also following the Q&A, we'll announce tonight's raffle winners for 2 book bundles of the Jewish Book Council staff picks. So Nat will come up and do that afterward. And now I am thrilled to introduce the wonderful 3 writers sitting next to me. First, Anita Diamond. Anita Diamond is the best-selling author of the novels Good Harbor, The Last Days of Dogtown, Day After Night, the collection of essays Pitching My Tent, and of course, The Red Tent. An award-winning journalist, she's the author of 6 nonfiction guides to contemporary Jewish life. Her latest book, The Boston Girl, has been called ravishing by the Boston Globe. And no small thing, Deborah Winger, Minnie Driver, and Brody's gorgeous wife from Homeland recently starred in the Lifetime miniseries based on her book. Please join me in welcoming Anita. To my left is Ruth Andrew Ellenson. Ruth is a journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, People, The Forward, and many other publications. She recently collaborated on editorial projects, including a forthcoming book with the late philanthropist Edgar Bronfman, and is currently working on a book with Michael Steinhardt. She received the National Jewish Book Award for editing the best-selling anthology, The Modern Jewish Girl's Guide to Guilt, Nice. The Seattle Times called the book lively and intelligent, 2 adjectives I'm sure you'll agree that can be used to describe my friend Ruthie. Please join me in welcoming her. And finally, in the middle, Elisa Albert is the author of the Book of Dahlia, How This Night is Different, and the editor of the anthology Freud's Blind Spot. Her fiction and nonfiction have appeared in many publications, including Tin House, The Believer, The Rumpus, and NPR. Her latest novel, After Birth, was just published and has been getting raves and showing up on the Instagram feeds of every single mom I know. The Journal has called the book a wonderful primal howl of a novel, though perhaps my favorite review came via her auntie Sarah on Twitter. It's not that you're so smart, it's just that you actually write what everyone else is thinking. Please join me in welcoming the very, very smart Elisa Albert. So there's a Nora Ephron line in one of the last essays she wrote before she died, and she talked about the things that she wasn't going to miss once she was no longer in this world. And one of the things she mentioned, alongside bras and funerals and emails, are panels about women in film. And I think it's kind of the perfect way to begin a panel about women and writing. How do you each feel about this question? Is the frame itself irritating and ghettoizing, or is there something rich and alive to you about this subject? And we're going to start with Anita on this one.
Is this on?
Yes.
I don't like this type. I'm tired of it. I feel like, and actually I think that the range of the writing in front of you tonight, and I hope you'll read everybody's books, demonstrates the breadth of the writing that Jewish women are doing. And while they share things, I think that the differences are really what's more interesting. And so putting them together, it's fine, and it gathers a wonderful group of people together to listen. But I'm not exactly, I've actually never been sure. And people, when people ask me, what makes a Jewish book, or a Jewish work of art, a Jewish work of art, I don't know. So, I don't know.
I would say that the label of women's writing is no more ghettoizing than the label of Jewish writing. And it's sort of, they're all communities of, I don't even know so much writing as much as readers. And I wonder if those labels allow people who have a general need to explore those aspects of their identity a way into that. I always think as writers, we talk a lot about how our work is perceived and our intentions for it. But the truth is, I think anyone who's fortunate enough, fortunate enough to have someone read what they write is sort of grateful in whatever category they come to it in.
And actually, Jewish women are great readers. So,
yes, where is Carolyn Hessel?
I mean, you cannot ask for a more enthusiastic audience.
Right, and I mean, the anthology that I edited that actually Elisa is in, the Modern Jewish Girl's Guide to Guilt, I can tell you that when it first went out with that title, it was sort of considered the most marginalized by Jews and women. They were the ones who were most self-conscious about it, but I think that ended up being its biggest selling point. So it would be disingenuous for me to object to those labels.
Interestingly, I was reading it on the Upper West Side, and I thought lots of people would come up to me for obvious reasons, but the guy who came up to me was a gay Catholic who was like, "What's that book about? I really relate to it."
A gay Catholic had to ask you about a book about
yes.
guilt? There you
like,
go.
Where can I find one about my own people?
I am glad I'm encouraging interfaith dialogue, however it happens. That's nice.
I don't have much to add except for, I blithely going along my way and making it over here tonight, and I'm not thinking too much about being a Jew or a woman. But, I get to the front entrance and there's a pretty elaborate security system in place, and suddenly I'm reminded that this is not what you find at MoMA, and this is not what you find at, the Children's Fire Truck Museum downtown, and where I've spent many hours. So, that to me is just it's a brief moment. It happens, it's over, but I'm reminded that it actually does matter, even though most of the time I like to go about my way pretending it doesn't.
I thought that Cynthia Ozick had a very, very interesting and provocative answer to this question. So if you'll bear with me while I share it, because I think it'll be a really good jumping off point. She said in 1997, "People often ask, how can I reject the phrase woman writer and not reject the phrase Jewish writer? It's a preposterous question. Jewish is a category of civilization, culture, and intellect, and woman is a category of anatomy and physiology. It's rough thinking to confuse vast cultural and intellectual movements with the capacity to bear children." Not subtle, that answer.
That's baloney.
And I'm wondering if you could each respond to it.
Baloney. I mean, to say that, just that the construct of femininity. I mean, how can you say that after Simone de Beauvoir? And I mean, it's a ridiculous thing to say. I'm flabbergasted.
That is exactly the kind of response I am looking for. Elisa, how about you?
I'm glad I could oblige.
I have learned never to take issue with any woman's way of understanding her place in the world, so I bow to Cynthia Ozick, and I respectfully disagree.
Well, right, and
Oh,
in a
that's
way,
good-
your
good
book
panel.
makes exactly the opposite claim. I mean, the protagonist of your book is very much more, in my reading of it, connected to her femininity or her womanhood, whatever word we want to use, than in a way her Jewishness.
Right. I don't know. I mean, with regard, it's hard to speak of both issues with the same, phrases. But with regard to womanhood, I have come to believe that it causes more suffering and takes more effort to deny what is essentially female with regard to the body than it does to embrace it. But I think that the pendulum has really swung wildly in that issue over time. I think my mother disagrees, but she's not here.
What would she say if she was?
I don't know. She might not completely disagree, but many of my own friends disagree. It's and I guess I do feel the same way about being Jewish. That the energy that it would take to deny it is so much greater than the energy it takes to embrace it and to feel comfortable and happy and like fully myself.
But I'm not denying womanness and
No.
the female body
No.
as, I've written a lot of childbirth scenes too, and that the female body is part of what it means to be, and physiology is important, and a gift and a curse and all of that. But that's part of that on top of that there's the construct of femininity so there's not an either or, at least for me.
Right. No, the construct can bite it, as can dictates about what is a good Jew or what you have to do, because, I also grew up in the household of somebody who was kind of Baal Tshuva and had a very, very hard time trying to inhabit it to the letter, and was quite miserable trying to inhabit it to the letter instead of relaxed and, just owning it. So it's interesting.
Before I lob more Cynthia Ozick quotes at you, let's get to actually talking about your books. So each of the books that you see on the screen has indeed been written by a Jewish woman, but as Anita mentioned, they're all very, very different with very specific and distinct voices. And I'm wondering, starting with Ruthie, if you can each tell us briefly what your book is about and also read something that will give us a taste of that voice.
The book is an anthology, which I had edited, which collects 28 Jewish women's voices about their experience of not conforming to community standards. I guess that's the best way to describe that briefly. And what happens in that liminal space between expectations that you are part of before your birth versus the reality of your own life. Not dissimilar to the paradigm that you guys were discussing before. It's an interesting question. And I'll just start a little bit with mine. And yeah, I'm not nervous at all. My father's sitting about 10 feet away. Your mom's in LA, so. All right. Between the ideal of who you should be and the reality of who you are lies guilt. And when you're Jewish, there seems to be no shortage of people who are willing to point out just how guilty you should feel. Families, rabbis, and communities happily, but perhaps not always so helpfully, are all too eager to bring it to your attention, or you can even agonize over it yourself. For me, it often takes the form of the following internal reprimand. Jews have barely managed to survive for thousands of years, and you little pisher, are going to make one bad decision and screw it up for everybody. The voice spoke up particularly loud and clear one day as I sat in the front pew of a church in Virginia, watching my grandmother sing in the choir about her Lord and Savior. She wasn't talking about Moses. While I am a rabbi's daughter, I'm also the child of a convert. My mother had converted to Judaism upon marrying, and when my parents divorced, I was raised in an observant home with my father, a rabbi and Jewish studies professor, making me part of a rather small group of daughters of the American Revolution who grew up going to shul on the Upper West Side. Still, I grew up knowing that a church dating back to the Civil War was just as much a part of my history as a shtetl in Russia. So there I sat, a rabbi's daughter in the church of her forefathers, bathed in the ruby light of stained glass windows depicting Jesus and paralyzed by guilt. What in the name of Maimonides was I doing here? I was sure my Jewishness was obvious. Okay, maybe not horns on my head obvious, but still obvious to all the good Christians around me. I desperately wanted to leave. Then my grandmother caught my eye and smiled, clearly delighted by my presence. Was it worse to betray my Judaism by sitting in front of a giant cross, or to disrespect my beloved grandmother by bolting? Oy. So, while the choir continued, I closed my eyes and began to sing Hear O Israel, Shema Yisrael, under my breath. It seemed a logical solution at the time, and wondered if my Jewish friends could see me now, what would they think? Would they understand that I was trying to bridge a gap for which I had no clear roadmap?
Yeah, you and, 140 characters on what your book's about.
Wait, I have a passage. I really do. Take your time. Okay. You want to go? No, you go. Somewhere. Okay. Here we go. My book is about a woman who has a baby and kind of loses her mind, and it's like the yellow wallpaper as rewritten by Philip Roth circa 73, I would say, give or take. That was what I was going for, anyway. In the cafe where I never work on my dissertation is the woman I've seen at the co-op with her brand new baby. We smile. Do you ever feel like you're completely losing your mind? Her smile fades. It's okay if you do. It's perfectly normal. Her roots are brown and gray. The rest is dyed red. She's probably doing that thing where you refuse to part with the first look you ever liked on yourself. When she was like 23, she probably dyed it for the first time and never got over being that girl with the red hair, loved making those salon appointments, felt very on top of herself. Oh, but sweetheart, time has passed you by. We're getting along fine, she says. Bitch, please. Sell it someplace else. How old is she? Head to toe pink, so safe assumption. 5 weeks, glass bead, bud in bud vase. Did you have an okay time with the birth? She actually flinches. Here, I say, tearing a page from my mostly empty notebook. Here's my number. If you ever need to talk or anything, call me. Women are not supposed to do this alone. I'll make her a casserole, sure thing. Hold the baby so she can take a shower or a nap. Nurse the baby if she wants. She takes the folded paper. Thanks. After she's gone, I do some research. Ancient Roman lore about a heroic woman who saves her imprisoned father from starvation and death by nursing him in secret. Roman charity, it's called. See also Rubens, Caravaggio, Steinbeck. Ask your grandmother's 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 grandmother. The Arabic term for people who were nursed by the same woman, some approximation of milk brother, implies a stronger relationship than that of two people actually born to the same woman. I write to my dissertation advisor. Guess what? I'm the neighborhood wet nurse now. How fourth wave is that?
You have to read both of these books. They're really, really wonderful. The Boston Girl is a coming-of-age story of Addie Baum, who's born in Boston in 1900 to parents who moved to the United States in the late 1890s from what's probably Poland now. She's the American-born daughter in a family where the other children were born overseas and then moved to the United States. So she is the Boston Girl. So this is the prologue. Ava, sweetheart, if you ask me to talk about how I got to be the woman I am today, what do you think I'm going to say? I'm flattered you want to interview me. And when did I ever say no to my favorite grandchild? I know, I say that to all of my grandchildren, and I mean it every single time. It sounds ridiculous or like I'm losing my marbles, but it's true. When you're a grandmother, you'll understand. And why not? Look at the 5 of you. a doctor, a social worker, 2 teachers, and now you. Of course they're going to accept you into that program, don't be silly. My father is probably rolling over in his grave, but I think it's wonderful. Don't tell the rest of them, but you really are my favorite. And not only because you're the youngest. Did you know you were named after me? It's a good story. Everyone else is named after, in memory of someone who died, like your sister Jessica, who was named for my nephew Jake. But I was very sick when you were born, and when they thought I wasn't going to make it, they went ahead and just hoped the angel of death wouldn't make a mistake and take you instead of me. Your parents weren't that superstitious, but they had to tell everyone you were named after your father's cousin Arlene, so people wouldn't give them a hard time. It's a lot of names to remember, I know. Grandpa and I named your Aunt Sylvia for your grandfather's mother, who died in the flu epidemic. Your mother is Clara, after my sister Celia. What do you mean you didn't know I had a sister named Celia? That's impossible. Betty was the oldest, then Celia, and then me. Maybe you forgot. Nobody told you? You're sure? Well, maybe it's not such a surprise. People don't talk so much about sad memories, and it was a long time ago. But you should know this, so go ahead, turn on the tape recorder. My father came to Boston from what must be Russia now. He took my sisters, Betty and Celia, with him. It was 1896 or maybe 1897, I'm not sure. My mother came 3 or 4 years later, and I was born here in 1900. I've lived in Boston my whole life, which anyone can tell the minute I open my mouth.
I'm curious about what drew each of you to these stories, and specifically Anita, I was wondering when reading it if any of your personal history was kind of woven in there.
No. I am the daughter of immigrants, but my story is very different. My parents were from big cities in Europe, and they came to the United States after the war. Addie's parents are peasants, and not happy that their daughter wanted to finish high school, much less go to college. So this is a story based on the history of the Jewish community in Boston and in New York and everywhere else in the beginning of the 20th century.
What sort of research did you do for it?
I really fell in love with the research for this book. It started with Rockport Lodge, which was a real place that Addie attends, and Rockport Lodge was a sort of fresh air fund inn for girls, young women in the beginning of the 20th century. You went $5 for a week, got you 3 meals a day, and sailing, of all things. Can you imagine going from a tenement where you're sharing a bed with at least one other person and having a bed to yourself and eating hot dogs on the beach? It's unheard of. So, but I did a lot of research about women's history in the early part of the 20th century, immigrant history in the early part of the 20th century, and Boston history. So I walk around the city with a very different lens on what happened there. And it was the early 20th century, the teens, the 20s, were a time of enormous change for women and girls, which weren't so different from the changes that I've lived through in the 70s and 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So enormous opportunities opening up, and challenges to all kinds of roles, and changes in clothing, hairstyles, everything changed. Popular culture, celebrity culture, all of that was invented actually in that part of the world in the 20th century, early 20th century.
And is the Baum family based on a particular family that you came across in your research?
The Baum family is a composite of families, and it based very loosely on one family that I read about that was connected with the Bennett Street settlement house, but very much elaborated and invented.
I was just going to say, you might not have written your family story, but I think you may have written my family story.
I hope not.
I hope. I was thinking one particular detail when you mentioned. Yeah, okay, so that part aside, but my grandmother grew up in Cambridge, daughter of immigrants, my father's mother, and there's always a story that my Bubby Stern used to take every grandchild aside and say, "You are my absolute favorite. Don't tell anyone else." I'm sure a lot of Jews have this story in their families, so.
What drew each of you to the stories you told?
I was full of thoughts of motherhood because I had a child. And so when he was about a year old and I could finally find some balance and start to work again, write again, have headspace. That's what was waiting for me, and I had an established writing practice, so that I'm not somebody who tends to go too far afield, so far. It's sort of like, what's troubling me? What am I thinking about? That's where I want to go delve into. So that's what was waiting for me when I sat back down at my desk.
Were you surprised by the roar that came out?
No. Yes and no. It took a while. The beginning stages of a novel are kind of just playtime. It's like, somebody brings out some Play-Doh and you don't even realize what you're doing for a while. You're just engaging with it, and then slowly something starts to emerge, and then you can take stock of what exactly it is and how to shape it. And
Did she get stronger? I'm curious. Does she get more and more angry, strong, roary, as you rewrote?
I think she started out sad, and then sadness is not that interesting. It's an interesting starting point, but it's not an interesting place to stay in life or writing, I don't think. So it's like, okay, here's some sadness. What else? Like, what's underneath that, and then what's underneath that, and then underneath sadness is always rage, and underneath rage is always sadness, and you can't really just engage with any one layer of it. So, yeah.
It's a layer cake.
Yes. Yum. Rage and sadness.
It makes me
All writers.
What do you frost that with?
It makes me think of that Amy Bender book. The Amy Bender book about a girl who could taste the feelings of whoever made the food that she was eating. It's like a nightmare. It's like a Jewish child's nightmare.
Tears, right? A lot of tears.
Cue the digestive cancers. God forbid. Sorry.
Ruthie, I think I can imagine what drew you to this subject, but do you want to talk a little bit about it?
Well, my background was as a journalist, so I think I guess a lifetime as a failed good Jewish girl, would probably be the most natural source of inspiration. But I think for me it was a question when I started to gather the essays. It was almost like field reporting. I think when you're a journalist, you sort of go out and you reach into other people's narratives, and you find out the more particular they are in their details, the more universal they become emotionally. It's sort of counterintuitive, but I found it to be very true in my journalism writing. I imagine you have too. And so when the essays started sort of coalescing, I looked to sort of balance the stories of things that were typical of one would imagine, like a Jewish guilt experience. There's an essay in there about a woman who refuses to take all of her mother's phone calls. And then her mother, gets caller ID in order to be able to screen those out. And so her mother retaliates by getting herself an unlisted number and calling from other numbers. So things that might be more typical, to the essay Elisa wrote about the New York Times divorce announcement, which was, the way we all herald every, Jewish marriage up to this ideal. What happens when you don't live up to that ideal and the reality of it? And sort of all those spaces in between, and tried to balance it also from different perspectives, things that are traditional to the Jewish narratives and things that might be more outside of it. So in some case, it was like the world's longest article. But I got to interview a lot of amazing people, and they got to tell their own stories.
Which essay or theme did you get the strongest reaction toward? Because I know which one I reacted to, and I'm curious.
I will tell you that I think one of my favorite comments I ever got at a Jewish Book Council event was a woman coming up to me. First of all, it was, I believe, in Florida, and she, from the line...
No one like this here.
Exactly. From the line, she started going, "Ruthie, you're not signing the books fast enough." So this was, I knew it was coming. And then when she came up to me, she goes, "This is not what I thought the book was about." And I was like, okay. I'm like, "What did you think the book was about?" She goes, "I wanted a guide to making my children feel more guilty. And this is not what it is." It's like what you shrug and you apologize and you say, "I'm sorry I failed you in this way," and you go on. You're used to it. But I'll tell you, originally one of the names I wanted for the book was Portnoy's Daughters. And per your comment, Anita, about the social changes that went on over the 60s and 70s, I feel like where Jewish guilt was a commodity largely perpetuated by Jewish men over their ambivalence about assimilation, what started to happen, I think, when we came of age was that Jewish women had choices that previously hadn't existed. I mean, I think women were being ordained as rabbis before any of us were born. And so what happens when you have all of this freedom? Do you become a prisoner of it? How do you honor the heritage? I mean, I was really interested in what you said before about the energy it would take to fight it. Because you want to incorporate it and you want to be loving towards that identity and honor it, but now that you had choices that were basically unprecedented for women in the history of Judaism, how did you navigate that and remain true to yourself? So, and now I'm very curious about which essay resonated with you.
I think just the one that I had the strongest reaction to was Ayala Waldman's.
Ah, yes. Ayala Waldman.
You all are going to need to read the book in order to know what I'm talking about.
She wrote an essay about her ambivalence towards Israel, having been raised as a lifelong Zionist. So 10 years before the trend, I would say.
Now that Philip Roth's name has been mentioned maybe more than once, he had a quote I came across that kind of, I thought, related to each of your books. He said, "People are unjust to anger. It can be enlivening and a lot of fun." And that's kind of how I felt reading Afterbirth. I was both kind of taken aback and laughing out loud at the same time. And I'm wondering if there's been a lot of kind of debate in the past few years about likability and should female protagonists be likable? Is it okay if they're unlikable? In fact, is it kind of higher literature if they're unlikable? And your book certainly your book certainly speaks to that. And I'm wondering, if you could weigh in on that question, and even if it occurred to you as you were writing.
It definitely occurred to me as I was writing, in that I wanted to go as far as I could against the whole question, because I find the whole debate so tiresome. It's just such a dead horse, and I think we should give the poor thing a proper burial, because we're just kicking it and kicking it and kicking it, and it stinks, and it's like clear that it's dead, and I think we should move on. I like to say that another term for likable narrator is liar. There is nobody whose private thoughts are 100% wonderful, and that's, in life, of course, we have to lie. I mean, we call that being a grown-up. We go through our lives as decent people, and we don't say everything we think, and we recognize that some things are not fair, and we try to be decent. But I don't want to do that in a book. When I open a book, it's relief from that. It's time to relax and close the door. Nobody's watching. You can actually go places, and I really cherish likability in the people around me. But in my art, I want to see some festering ugliness.
Anita, I'm curious what your response is to that. Personally,
wrote a
there's a lot
very-
of books I love with likable narrators.
My narrator is so likable. You would hate this book.
She's festering and
It's a
ugly.
festering. No, she's not festering. But this is a grandmother talking to her grandchild about her life, so she's certainly editing things. And every now and then she does stop and say, "It's probably more than you need to know about your grandmother's sex life. That we'll leave that aside." So she leaves. Although she does tell a few stories that she wasn't proud of. But so I cherish likability in characters and in books. Not that a book full of likable characters, impossible. That's Disney. Actually, it's not even Disney. You've got to have an evil stepmother, right? Which isn't to say that I didn't really enjoy your book, but I mean, I would imagine that the narrative that I did is sort of the opposite of that, because she's the grandmother I hope to be someday.
It reminds me of Marilyn Robinson, like Gilead or Home. I love those books too.
What a relief.
I'm not saying that only art about horribleness can be meaningful. Just that when we omit anything on the human spectrum, we're lying. And you see that sometimes. You see an attempt to kind of just glide over the surface. And, to each his own. Everybody wants to.
My book has been accused of that, actually.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
By who?
By
Call them out right now.
evil reviewers. But not a lot of them.
They're just jealous.
I think there's a deeper point here than just likable, unlikable, which is that, is it Adie or Addie? Addie Baum is living in a squalid tenement. She's working in a shirtwaist factory. She gets one vacation a year at this Rockport Lodge, and yet she's pretty happy and uncomplaining and grateful. And it strikes me that we kind of couldn't have an American Jewish character like that today. It's like our complaints, it really got me thinking about, can there be a voice like that today, or are we kind of so inward or so kind of privileged in a way, I don't love that word, that we are complaining about, the height of men in our dating pool, not, living, with 7 other people in a sweltering, festering slum.
Well, but the thing is with this, one of the things I wanted to do with this book, although Addie is certainly likable and she's got gumption, as someone says early on. I love that word, very early 20th century word. She lives in a family of tremendous pain, and it's not the happy immigrant story. I mean, it's a story where people...
No, but her reaction to it is great.
Get me out of here. Her attitude is also immigrant reaction, which is get me out of here, and she finds another world to be part of because her family... her parents and one of her sisters certainly are really locked into and are trapped by their immigrantness. So it's not a happy immigrant story altogether. She triumphs over it, and actually one of her older sisters also triumphs in a very different kind of Hadassah, all-American Jewish woman way, and turns out to be one of the heroines of the book in a way. But it's complicated, and I think that the bootstraps fantasy narrative of immigration is also part of the American mythology, and so I wasn't interested in telling that. But she does take advantage of anything she can because other people, women in particular, see something in her, recognize it in her. You're smart, you've got spunk. Come here, let me help you. And she responds. So it's very much about teachers and older women seeing something in her and helping her just because she's there and they see it, not for any other reason than to do good in the world. So,
I'm wondering, Elisa and Ruthie, if you've had different reactions, and I assume you have, to your books from older women who are kind of like people have given birth before, they survived. That is a reaction that I have heard. And
Did someone actually say that to you? No.
A few people have said that to me about your book.
I always find it's roughly, I don't pay too much attention other than what's actually in my face. If somebody comes up to me at a reading and, pins me to the wall, then I have to listen. But I think I get a vague sense that it's 85%, readers who are kind of open to hearing whatever this experience is, and 15% who are just not, and their complaints can range, but basically stick within the confines of who cares? Why do we have to talk about this stuff? And it's okay, so it's not a book for you, but the argument that birth doesn't matter doesn't hold a lot of weight. I don't think. I think it's a hard argument to make.
I definitely got a generational divide in terms of reaction to the anthology. I was just thinking. I remember when it got the National Jewish Book Award, there was a colleague, I believe, of my father's who wrote to the Jewish Book Council to protest the National Jewish Book Award, saying that it should never have received it because I had a quote from the beginning from Tony Kushner talking about guilt from Angels in America. And obviously, Tony Kushner was a self-hating Jew. And how could they give a book award to this? And then I believe, if I've got the story correct, this person came up to my stepmother at a conference and said, I had a very good conversation with Ruthie, and I think she realized her mistake in putting the book together. And my stepmother had a very classy response, which was, thank you for your feedback. So you can tell that she's held a rabbinical pulpit for many years. And then also in terms of the reactions from women, I would say that there was definitely, I grew up, my friend Judith Rosenbaum's in the audience tonight. She's the head of the Jewish Women's Archive, and her mother, Paula Hyman, was one of the pioneering Jewish feminists and a professor of history at Yale. And I believe there were a lot of people who had really fought for equality in the Jewish world. And when they saw a title like The Modern Jewish Girl's Guide to Guilt, there was sort of a reaction of, Ruthie, what have you done? And then you would get other people who came up saying, if only I'd had this book smuggled in with me at Camp Ramah. You know, so, and both things, some of the most interesting reactions to the book. I mean, I think basically, this is nonfiction, and we're talking about 2 novels here, but I think with any writing, there's a desire for truth, you know, that's really what you want to go for more than anything else. And then also it becomes an ink blot. I mean, when you write something, you see people's reactions have much to do with reflecting their realities as it does with anything you've intended, which is a fascinating lesson. You know, junior high school come to life when there's a mean girl and somebody says, you know, her reaction has nothing to do with you, it's all about her, and you're like, that's not true. It turns out it is true. And writing something in public allows you to see that in very sharp relief.
And to be perfectly honest, when I saw the title, I went, ugh. But I loved the book.
You're not alone, Anita.
I loved the book, and I enjoyed all of the essays in it, especially Rachel Kadish's book on the guilt, what is it, the guilt?
Guilt Judo.
Guilt
Rachel
Judo,
Kadish, who's
yeah.
a really brilliant writer based in Boston, wrote a novel about being the child of Holocaust survivors, how in a family of Holocaust survivors, basically nothing you do or no bad experience you have ever trumps the Holocaust, right? No one can argue with this.
There's a great moment in Sex and the City about that. I don't know if you remember.
Really?
Where Charlotte is...
They obviously ripped it off from the book.
Huh? You remember?
No, tell us the moment.
You want the moment? Charlotte's having sex with, what was his name? Harry.
We're just packing it all in here.
Yes,
I love
right.
this.
She wants to marry him, and he says something while they're doing this. But I promised my grandmother that I would only marry a Jewish woman, and she was in the Holocaust. So Charlotte says, well, she gets off of him, and she says, well, I can't argue with that. When you brought up the Holocaust, that's it. It's like, she gives up.
I will tell you that in one of my my less patient moments, I did finally retort to somebody who said something about the title being offensive. I said, well, if it was called The Modern Jewish Woman's Guide to Identity, post-feminism, it might not have sold as many copies.
No, I agree. But I had to get past it. And I don't know exactly why, because I know why, because I've been fighting against guilt my whole life. And it's like, I don't,
How's that going? Have you won?
Not so good.
Luckily,
but,
there's a guide.
No.
Yeah.
But I wrote a book called How to Raise a Jewish Child.
Yes.
And basically when I sign it, it's like, with joy. And there's a whole thing about, it's not about guilt, it's about joy. That's how you raise a Jewish child. And I know I'm sort of arguing, I'm swimming upstream, but that's the point. It's like, enough, joy. That's what it's about.
Would it really be a panel of Jewish women writers if we didn't have some, something to discuss and debate? This is part of the...
Actually, the nice thing about this panel is that, in fact, there is a conversation and debate, because often they're very, sort of you say your thing, and then you say your thing, and then I say my thing, and then you thank everybody, and then we go home.
Thank you.
So I think this is remarkably...
What else?
Yeah. Okay, let's get to some festering darkness again, and then I'll actually ask the Jewish Book Council staff to come around and collect the questions. Now's a perfect time to do that.
I think we should approach the festering darkness with joy.
Yes, we are. We're going to. We're going to. The layer cake between the two of you is really nice. Okay, page 115.
Joy, damn it.
Joy or else.
Right.
So a lot of the...
Page 115?
Yes, and I'll kind of frame it this way. A lot of the essays in The Modern Jewish Guide to Guilt kind of speak about the tension between loyalty to one's own desires and loyalty to one's tribe, in this case, the Jewish one. And I'm curious about how that tension affects the stories you tell and the way you tell them, if at all. And there was a moment in Afterbirth, and I hope this will provoke all of you to buy it, where Ari meets the father. Ari's the protagonist of the book. She meets the father of her college roommate, and there's a pretty intense paragraph that I'm hoping you can read that begins with, "Our friendship ended."
You want me to read that paragraph?
Yes, I do.
She's not excited about reading this paragraph.
You set me up. No, okay.
Get ready to get pinned against the wall by a lot of people in this room.
Our friendship ended. Our friendship ended when I went home with her for Rosh Hashanah, and her father turned out to be this vile fulfillment of every Semitic stereotype you've ever heard. I mean, the guy was like a Nazi cartoon made flesh. Greasy, fat, balding, hook nose, sallow complexion, spit when he talked, black standard issue yarmulke, overpowering body odor, sweat spots in the armholes of his food-stained collie pot and button-down. It was like he was done up as dirty Jew for the KKK Halloween party. He went out of his way to welcome me, zeroed right in. Ariella, grandchild of survivors, I hear. Yup. And somehow, within about 3 minutes, we arrived at how the Palestinians didn't deserve to live. They're lucky we let them exist. It's charity. Shira was helping her mother serve soup back and forth between the kitchen and the dining room. She made a sad face at me like, yeah, whatever, he's a little over the top. It went on and on. He hit all the high notes. We could wipe them out like nothing. We should. Israel has always belonged and will always belong to the Jewish people. The concerns of a filthy bunch of nomads are not our problem. Excuse me, but that's like really racist. Shira came back with the last of the soup. Everyone else at the table was eating or nodding or staring off into space. Can I stop there?
Yes.
Good, because it goes on.
So I'm wondering, is there any hesitation on your part to put a paragraph like the description of the father into the world?
Obviously not. I'm sort of an equal opportunity shit disturber. And I think that that's a reasonable thing to be. So, I get a lot of shit from everybody because I manage to offend everybody, but, everybody deserves a little bit of it.
But wait, but you were talking about truth, right? And truth and journalism. That's true. I mean, that's not untrue. That is not.
That is a portrait of a type of person who I think we've probably all encountered, and who's not entirely evil. If you wrote a whole novel about that guy, you would definitely find a way to empathize with him and find a real humanity there. But that's not this novel. He's a passing character. I don't think I'm implying that every single Jew is like that. I don't think that's fodder for anti-Semites. If it is, then okay. But
It doesn't matter what you meant. I
Thank
just
you.
got two emails from, I don't know where they're from and they liked the book until page 215 or whatever it was, and because I talked about how one character, Addie's talking about her husband saying, I think after Ronald Reagan was elected, I think that did it for him and he died. It's like, this guy spent his life fighting, liberal battles, and these two women were furious that they called me hater. It invalidated the book for them. They were going to tell their friends not to read it. That's all they saw in the whole book.
the alternative would be to try to write a book that didn't offend those people, and then you're in shackles. So don't bother.
It doesn't matter what you do.
Yeah.
Someone's going to find the thing that they didn't like, and
Yeah.
that they're going to say, this ruined the book for me, or it's not worth reading because you wrote that.
Godspeed.
Questions from the audience. I'm interested in hearing about each writer's process. Advice to young writers. Who wants to start?
I don't know what to tell you. My process is a lot of procrastination and worrying, and I've often been asked if I teach writing, and I don't because I don't know how to. I really have no idea how to teach anyone how to write. I do a lot of research before I start, but I continue doing research while I'm writing. When I'm in a writing groove, I work more in the morning than later, after I'm caffeinated and after I've walked the dog and washed the dishes. And,
Watch some YouTube clips?
No, I avoid that. I find writing really difficult, and I do. I find it really hard. But I don't know how to do anything else, and I'm really glad when I finished a book, and that gets me going on another one. And it's a very unsatisfying answer, I think. And what I tell young writers is that they need to read more, and they need to read from different cultures and in translation. If you can't read French, none of us can really read enough well in another language. Most of us can, anyway. So read deeply, broadly from different eras. I think a lot of young writers don't go back to, early English novels, the great treasure trove of those, and to read books from different parts of the world and from different cultures. And that's my advice to young writers. Read, 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 revise, revise, revise.
That's so well put. Yeah. I agree with all of that. I second all of that. I procrastinate a lot too, but I don't call it procrastination. I call it self-care.
Washing the dishes is self-care?
Yes, in a way.
Okay.
In a way. I make a lot of room around writing. And I have to, because I don't respond well to like the sort of hard driving, like, now you will work. Like I rebel against that, and I can't do anything. So it has to be coming from a place of like real relaxation and like a really nice, mellow, kind of soft feeling. I practice yoga a lot. But I've learned not to say like, oh, I'm going to like get a massage, or I'm going to acupuncture, I'm going to go to yoga, or I'm going to do X, Y, Z, because people, it sounds ridiculous. It sounds totally self-indulgent. It sounds like you're wasting your time. You're a dilettante. What are you doing with your time? You can't explain to people that like I need to like be at the end of that to start what I need to do. So I've learned to just kind of say, I need to go work. And my, 5 hours of work include 2 hours of like lying on the floor, listening to music, and, lighting candles and whatever.
Are crystals involved? I feel like you're really like getting to...
I could tell you, but I believe that true esoterica has to be a secret. So, but yeah, I spend a lot of time circling around it in a way that feels like very nourishing.
But you're working while you're doing that, aren't you? Somewhere in the back there? Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, walking the dog is writing.
Yes. Yes.
I just had a brainstorm in the bathroom at MoMA.
Like, yeah.
I did. Yeah. I'm not kidding. I did.
A relaxed brain is a creative brain. A stressed out brain is not a creative brain. Relaxation is key.
Ruthie, how about you?
As a journalist, I would say have a deadline and panic. Definitely a lot of procrastination, but from a different place. I mean, you guys are creating universes inside of your head, and so I feel like there's also a level that goes on there. I feel like I'm always trying to observe as accurately as I can, and everything you were saying about reading and revision, and then when that all coalesces, there's a feeling of being connected to something larger than yourself, which I think is the most joyful process of writing. I don't always know if it's when it's complete. I'll finish something, read it, think it's brilliant, read it again, think it's literally the worst thing I've ever read in my life. How could I have produced this? And so there's a whole emotional roller coaster, but I do feel like having deadline and structure, I'm grateful for having a journalism background. I feel like that gives you a real sense of deadline and word count and having to be effective with language that I think serves any type of writing endeavor very well. And the sense that there's an editor out there, even if it's a phantom one, who's going to scream at you if you don't get this in on time.
I would have never written a novel without being a journalist first, without deadlines.
Interesting.
I mean, they're internalized,
Yeah.
You don't get paid if you don't turn it in on time, right?
That is a huge
That's
motivation.
a huge, yes, it is. So I give myself
That
deadline.
is.
And not only am I one of the few people who mostly meets her deadlines, her contract deadlines, but I give myself deadlines.
You're giving the rest of us a bad
no,
reputation.
no.
You got to
But
stop doing that.
But it's like, okay, by the end of June, I want to be this far. And if I'm close to that, it's okay. But, so on and on and on. But I think deadlines are really important.
Yeah.
This question is a thoughtful one. My grandmother's generation was more resilient. The women had more adversity and less choices. Today, many of us participate in the culture of kvetch. We have more choices than ever and less adversity, but more overall confusion and dissatisfaction. Does complaining or expression of emotions make us less resilient? I hope that I read that properly.
Who came up with the culture of kvetch? Well done. We applaud you editorially. Nice job.
That's a good title for the next one.
I was going to say.
Volume 2.
Any responses to that?
I mean, I feel like that's a question.
Well, I think the more things change, the more things stay the same. And older I get, the more I hear that line, there's nothing new under the sun. And it's kind of comforting to me as I look at the newspaper and want to tear my hair out and rend my clothing. I'm reading my son these days a great Sims Tobacco book called Kibitzers and Fools, and it seems like there were a lot of kvetchers in the shtetl. I think it's true that things are moving faster, and we have so many outlets, and so much is competing for our brain space, and there's so much just like coming at our eyeballs all the time, and that I think is where some of the new problems are coming from, for me at least. I think human nature has kind of remained the same and will remain the same. I mean, that makes the most sense to me of any theory that I've heard. I guess I have to believe that, otherwise everything just seems insane and hopeless and horrible.
Do not read about artificial intelligence then.
Okay.
I was going to say, another term for kvetch might be processing. It's also a reflection of greater sociological choices that Jewish Americans have now, that were frankly inconceivable probably to our grandmothers or great-grandmothers. Jews, by and large, are white people in America, and that was not the experience 3 or 4 generations back. So, one person's kvetch is another person's processing. Maybe we've transferred it from the shtetl to therapists' offices on the Upper West Side, but it is the same reflection of human nature, I think, in the same way. It's trying to figure out how to navigate freedom, which is something all Americans do in their own way. I mean, I think any American who's part of an ethnic minority, and I've had lots of conversations about this with friends of mine, to be American is to believe in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the idea of the supremacy of the individual. And if you're part of a minority group, that's a lie. That it is about how you function within the larger group, where your loyalties lie. And I think those two things come in tension constantly. Dara Horn's essay in the book deals with that question, I think, very beautifully. And so I think that's part of what the kvetching might be about.
That question obliterates another reality too. Not that I disagree with either of what you just said, but as Addie says, no, it's complex. Reality is complex. It's not an either or, and it's not, they were more resilient than we are today. As Addie says to her granddaughter, don't let anyone tell you that everything's worse today than it used to be. It's so much better, and the opportunities for women are better, and the power of women to make things better is, it's head and shoulders above what it used to be. And I'm the old woman up here, and I remember not being allowed to wear pants to school, and there's on the most, and clothes play a big part in this book, and the liberation that comes from not having your skirt down to here and not having your waist into here, and that's the most trivial, but also the most embodied kinds of changes that have happened to women in the last 150 years. Jewish women, American women, all women, not all women. I mean, the world is full of disaster for women, but. As far as Jewish women's kvetching, it is the kvetch of privilege, and it's also a kvetch of power, and then wanting to make it better, and having enough energy and enough strength to make some things better and to see where we ought to be going, and be impatient with making the world a better place that we can see.
I love you.
And the kvetch of power, I think, is another good title. Kvetching
of power. Kvetching is a powerful thing.
And as you were saying that, I'm realizing, I am free to sit up here in jeans with my legs crossed like a man, and I don't think twice about it.
Right.
And it's it wouldn't cross my mind that I would have to stay like this the whole time. So I apologize if I'm offending anybody. Also, I just saw the revival of the Heidi Chronicles on Broadway, and I highly recommend it. It speaks to a lot of these issues very beautifully.
How has Jewish tradition informed your works? You could also take another one.
Well, no, you know what?
Okay, take it.
All these questions are wonderful. I grew up, I think for me, definitely, I grew up in a house where to be Jewish was to love the intellectual. It was to really wrestle with the question of identity being part of a larger community than yourself, and to revel in those questions and their history and their complexity. And one thing, although I may have not, Elisa and I actually grew up in a similar world in Los Angeles. I would call it maybe conservadox, is that right? Elisa were you in elementary school with my brother Micah?
Yeah, we
Is
were
that
at
right?
Temple Emmanuel Community Day School.
So we're playing some Jewish geography here.
Yeah.
But good old days, right?
Conservadox. My mother was totally assimilated and had kind of a midlife crisis, became very fully Jewish, and like moved further and further along in the observance spectrum.
So I definitely grew up and I felt a very privileged Jewish intellectual environment, which I loved. But the religious traditions that I grew up with, I found very constrictive and that I failed at miserably. I mean, I remember feeling triumphant eating, this is so great to say this with my father 10 feet away from me, eating pepperoni pizza on Pesach when I was 10 years old on Broadway and feeling this moment of unmitigated glee. Now, I'm not proud of this in retrospect, but
Such a
it's
Jewish
true.
thing to do.
Such a Jewish thing to do, right? Exactly. When with another rabbi's daughter, it was really perfect. But also knowing how deeply informed I was by that love of complexity. I mean, and sarcasm and humor, all these things that I consider to be so inherently Jewish and sort of the best parts of the culture. I remember a couple years ago, I was with my mother in North Carolina at a family reunion, and I made some type of joke she thought was sarcastic. And she looks at me, and sarcasm does not fly in south of the Mason-Dixon line with the same effect it does in New York City. And she looked at me and she went, "Ruthie, I understand you find that type of humor amusing, but I can tell you that I do not." And I looked at her and I was like, well, you're the one who married a Jew, and now you have a sarcastic Jewish writer-daughter in New York. You did this to yourself.
What did she say to that?
Well, this is how you know my mom is not Jewish. She looked at me and she said, well, I suppose you have a point. My stepmother, who's also sitting right here, would not have had a similar response. Safe it to say that she's somebody who nobody messes with at the cheese counter at Zabar's. So while the religious aspect of it, the communal part, was something I loved and found very warm and nurturing, the religious observance I wasn't good at, but I consider my Jewish heritage to be a love of intellectualism, and unabashedly so. So I'm grateful for that part of it.
I grew up culturally Jewish, ethnically Jewish. My parents moved to the United States after the war. They both survived. They both survived in internment camps in Switzerland, although they lost a lot of family. They came to the United States. Religion, not so much. But politics was Jewish. Classical music was Jewish. The food was Jewish. The passion for food, and the food isn't actually so good. It was that Eastern European. But passion for it, how important it is to make your own kreplach, and how nobody's kreplach are as good as my kreplach. And Democratic Party politics was being Jewish. I mean, everything, the world was Jewish, we were Jewish, Hanukkah and Passover, that was about it. And it was not until I was an adult that I started getting interested in this, because I fell in love with someone who wasn't Jewish, and I had to figure out what it meant to me. So then I got to choose it. I got to choose what I wanted to do, how I wanted to do it. So I had a lot of freedom and a lot. I had plenty of baggage, but it wasn't around religious tradition, and it wasn't about Judaism. I mean, I didn't learn. I don't think I knew what the Shema was until I was 13 or 14, and I was in confirmation class because my 12-year-old brother had to have a bar mitzvah, so I went to religious school too. So.
And I assume you did not have a bat mitzvah?
No.
But it wasn't done then, right? Usually for girls.
I think they did.
Sort of.
There were some girls were doing it. My daughter did. I didn't.
Last question before we wrap it up. Addie, your character, says at the beginning of The Boston Girl to her granddaughter, she says, "How did I get to be the woman I am today? It started in the library, in the reading club. That's where I started to be my own person." So I'd love to end by asking each of you to talk a little bit about your reading lives. Who set you on your journey, or who are you reading now? And this is a chance to plug books or even TV or movies that you are loving. We already got the Heidi Chronicles, so Ruthie, let's start with you.
That's such a great question, Bari, because I think nobody becomes a writer without first falling in love with reading. I was obsessed with Greek myths as a kid, obsessed. I used to make my friends play Greek myths Barbie, which was as nerdy and uncool as it sounds, and I was very strict about it. So I remember falling in love with reading Greek mythology on the one hand, and then also the All in the Kind family books as a little girl, which have just been, I believe, recently reissued. Clearly, there are other readers of those books. I remember falling in love with both of those worlds, which frankly couldn't be more different, but both resonated for me so deeply, and I just thought, if this is what reading is, like, give me more, wanting that, unabashedly. Now, God, there's so many books to recommend, and it's an interesting point about television also. I feel like these, serialized novels have come out in all of these binge-watching opportunities, and are also writers, Jewish women doing amazing work like Jenji Kohan and Jill Soloway, all of these people who are really reveling in the complexities of identities and just writing them in different formats. And I know that everyone decries the death of the book because reading requires patience and time, which is something that is increasingly absent in modern life. But there's so many wonderful other ways to consume stories and narratives these days that I feel like it's just the paradigm shifting a little.
I loved books as a kid. My mother was a huge reader, and she was voracious, and I, at some point, started just picking up all of her books, so like we were reading Amy Tan together and John Irving and Ann Tyler, and and I read like the adult Judy Blume books like Smart Women and Wifey, which
Summer
were
Sisters.
amazing. Yeah, like page 76 in Wifey. Whoa. So I learned from my mother, really, like she went to books. Like I saw her consuming books to find out what she needed to know, like just with this hunger. And I got that from her, and I'm so grateful to her for that. It's just the biggest gift of my life. I'm reading a book by Eula Biss called On Immunity now, which is fascinating. It's a lyrical nonfiction exploration about the vaccination issue. So interesting, smart writer. I just finished a Susannah Sonnenberg memoir called She Matters, which I loved. She lives in Missoula, Montana. She was a New York City born and raised daughter of some intense characters. And it's a book about her female friendships, which somebody said to me, I can't believe, have you read this book? And I said, no. And they said, I can't believe you didn't read this book before you wrote your book. And it turned out it was a little uncanny when I was reading it. It's like, oh, wow, same ground. It's amazing when that happens. It's like a nice validation. Like you both found your way to something independently, so it must matter. It must be worthy of contemplation. What else? I'm reading the Heidi Chronicles now. It's amazing. I had never read it. I was a little too young when it came out the first time. Yeah, on and on. I could go on for a while. Oh, one more. The poet, you just reminded me because I think you would love this book. The poet Rachel Zucker, who I highly recommend. Just her most recent book, she writes poetry and nonfiction, and her most recent book is about her mother, who was a very well-known storyteller whose name is escaping me now. Anyway, she's writing about her difficult relationship with her mother. She shows the book to her mother at the end, and she's very worried about what her mother's going to think. Her mother writes to her from a hotel in China to say, I've just read your book. You cannot publish this. It will kill me if you publish this. Literally puts the pen down and dies of a heart attack. So the end of the book is, so talk about guilt. You would love this book.
Yeah, we're gonna have to do a new version.
It is like the mother of all mother-daughter books. Rachel
Zucker.
Zucker.
Of her to drop dead, though.
I think it complicated things for her daughter a little bit.
But it was also very thoughtful.
But who was right? Who was right, Anita? That's what you have to remember.
Right?
Who was right?
Daughter's always right.
Anyway, the writing is beautiful, so check it out.
Good list.
The last few books I read were these two, actually, on airplanes, and I really enjoyed them enormously, and they kept me from pulling my hair out on long flights, which is good. And actually, that experience of being lost in a book is something that doesn't happen to me very often, and I remember as a child feeling that, just being able to sit down and read, which happened to me when I read the Harry Potter books. I felt like I was 10 years old. I sat down, and leave me alone. I have to find out what happens next. I owe my love of reading to my father, who I remember reading to me and my brother when we were children. I remember him reading to us stuff that we had no idea what he was. I think he just wanted to read these books. He read Jack London to us as children. I have no memory of it, but I know he read The Call of the Wild to us. And I also remember there was a children's book about a church mouse that ate books, and a cat who listened to the mouse and said, "I could listen and listen and listen." My brother and I are still looking for that book.
Is it The Cricket in Times Square?
No, it was
That
a very
was one of my favorites. Yeah.
no, but maybe it's that same thing. But from him I learned this love of reading and of books, and I think I'm really in love with the oral tradition and which is why I like poetry, because I think it demands that you really slow down. For one thing, you really have to slow down, and it really only makes sense if you read it out loud to some extent. So I actually I have a stack of poetry books next to the bed, and it helps me go to sleep because it slows you down, and also you have to savor the words one at a time, or at least a sentence, a phrase at a time, and I think that's kind of palate cleansing for someone who reads a lot and who reads the newspapers and the New Yorker and all that stuff. So.
Thank you all for participating in this joyful kvetch of power.